Let's look at Virginia Woolf as a writer of modernism, and modernism that has no history of its own, in the sense that there is no version of modernism in the 19th century that is accepted by people in the 20th century. And before I explain this point, let me tell you a general kind of idea regarding the modern that English criticism has started using in the last 15-20 years. Initially, modernity began with the end of the medieval period, but then there was a problem, because in the 20th century a large number of writers who wielded influence, who became strong in their ideas, they started saying that the 20th century was modern and the earlier period was not modern in this sense in which the 20th century is modern. And when they were asked the question, or when they asked the question from themselves, where do we place then people like Shakespeare and Milton and Spencer? And then the answer given was, okay, all that period starting from Chaucer up to the 20th century is modern period, but modern period also has its divisions, and so there is a early modernism and there is later modernism. So these days, in the last 15-20 years, we generally refer to Chaucer and Shakespeare as early moderns. Modernity came at that time, so they were early voices of modernism, and the real modernism, the intense modernism, the strong modernism, the authentic modernism is the modernism that we confront in the 20th century. So this is the via media that has been evolved by people who are facing this problem of modernity. So I would in fact focus upon these three words a little specifically. There is a thing called modern, there is a thing called modernity. They mean more or less one and the same thing, that if you are a modern, then you have modernity. If you have modernity, then you are a modern. And a modern outlook is that outlook which is critical of medievalism, which is critical of tradition and orthodoxy, which is critical of the idea of Genesis, idea of God. That is modernism. Because as I said in the other lecture also, that in the people who were secular and humanist, they were the people who not directly criticizing divinity, but they took their attention away from from divinity and started thinking in humanist terms. So they were called humanist and secular. And in the 20th century, these people started saying that is not modern, because that is too logical. And why should we be logical? Why should we not be just be what we are? And if you ask back the question as to what we are, then they give all kinds of answers. They will talk about myth, they will talk about legend, they will talk about something that is unhistorical, ahistorical, and they would say that also is us. Anyway, so this debate took very loud shape in the 20th century, when modern and modernity were rejected. Instead, modernism and modernist, not modern and modernity, but modernist and modernism, they were the respectable terms. And what does modernist mean? Modernist means that you believe in the reality of the 20th century, and that you confine your ideas to the 20th century alone, and whatever happened in the 20th century, reaction to that should be presented in such specific terms that only that is called modern. So this is a new definition of modernity, and in that I'll now explain to you as to what is modernism and how modernism and modernist is different from the secular humanist kind of ideal that modernity and modern people earlier pursued. Modernity and modernism have no connection with each other. The latter is confined specifically to the decades leading to the First World War and the writer emerging in its wake. Now, I am not saying that there were no other writers who should have been discussed in the first 20 years of the 20th century, but only some writers were discussed. Others were not discussed. They were supposed to be looking backwards. They were supposed to be too much steeped in society, whereas modernists, they were authentic people. They were talking only about the conditions of war and individuals' loneliness. So loneliness became a specific aspect of modern life. So where do I belong in the 20th century European context? Suppose I ask this question. Suppose I was born in England or in other parts of Europe, and people asked me where I belong. What do I say? In the 19th century, this question should not be raised. But in the 20th century, this question is raised. Who am I? Where do I belong? And then the answer given was weird. The answer was, I belong nowhere. I belong not to the family. I belong not to society. I belong not to a country. I belong not to an idea. I belong to myself. And what is that self? That self is lonely. That self is the lack of connection. So in fact, the words such as being, they became very, very important in the 20th century. So you have a sense of being, and you go into that being. Being means feeling to be. You live, I live, and the way I feel I live, that is important. Now just see that this is what modernism is. And most of the 20th century writers, and good writers like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, they talk about this particular aspect, that we are 20th century people. We have no connection with history. We have connection only with ourselves and with our mind, with our imagination, and that we are totally different from others. So we will talk about, they say, we talk about language in such a manner that it starts looking towards us. So loneliness, solitude, alienation, later on even absurdity, later on even lack of meaning, all these things are peculiar to the 20th century. Now actually there is a reason for this. The reason is that in the 20th century the First World War cannot be supported, but it cannot be attacked also, because if you attack, then where do you go? Then you go to a world which is bothered about peace, and nobody is talking about peace in the 20th century Europe. People talk about the war and about the somehow uselessness of war. So uselessness itself becomes a kind of value in the 20th century. So if a person feels useless, then that person is modernist. Most of the writing of the 20th century that comes under the idea of modernity always talks about uselessness, always talks about lack of idea, lack of ideal. And the other thing that I'll talk about the other thing, but then this idea of loneliness, this idea of peculiarity, this idea of strangeness, this idea of not being like any other person, this is a modernist trait, and this has no sanction in the previous time, but in the 20th century this becomes the major trait. I do not want to go into the things that are happening outside Europe, and because modernism actually is peculiar to Europe alone. So I would not go into that. But if you have to just look at the whole thing a bit more objectively and understand it in a context, then you might say, are there modernist writers in India in the same time, at the time of the First World War? Our answer would be no. We don't have modernist writers in India. We have writers, who are committed to society. We have Tagore, for instance. He is alive and kicking. He is quite active and alert in the times of the war. And in fact, most of his novels are written around the First World War, but he doesn't say he is lonely. He doesn't say he doesn't have an ideal. He doesn't say that life is a waste. Therefore, he is not modernist, but he is definitely modern. But anyway, I don't want to go into that question. We have to confine ourselves to Virginia Woolf and other modernists. So I would say that modernism in the 20th century actually is confined only to conditions that the First World War created. This is to be kept in mind. And since you cannot support the First World War, it represented only destruction, it represented only waste, it represented, bloodshed for no reason or rhyme, for no idealism either. You are not fighting for patriotism, you are not fighting for any identity, you are fighting just like that, and you are changing sides. Therefore, these people, they started saying life is a waste, and let's take this sense of waste seriously. So most of the modernist writing of the 20th century, particularly confined to Europe and England, is the kind of reality that doesn't give you any positive answers. They only give you negative answers, and negative answers also are not critical. They are to accept. So there is a kind of a laziness about modernism. Lazily you accept the sense of fate. So this is what the First World War did to us, and let's not forget. Maybe this thing should be brought out also in the critical area. That First World War may have given the idea of waste to Europe, but First World War also gave the first socialist country to the world, Soviet Russia, and Soviet Russia was full of passion, was full of positive thinking. They struggled very hard to, in the economic terms and political terms, to come out of exploitation and joblessness, and they became a free country. That was freedom of a different kind, and then they forged ahead and started challenging the rest of the world. That also happened around the same time as the First World War occurred. First World War comes to an end in 1917-18, and exactly in that year, Soviet Russia also emerges. So after that, our attention changes. We are either for socialism or we are against socialism. And if you extend this point further, then you would say that most of the modernist writers, they would be against socialism. They would not think of socialism as anything important, whereas the third world thinks of socialism very important. So anyway, I'm just being a bit specific in the context of modernism to tell us that it's a writing that has its points, and those points have to be understood, but then it also has to be critically examined. So writers emerging in the First World War, they consider themselves to be modern. This is the point I made to begin with. Now let's get back to Virginia Woolf, because all the points that I have so far made, they are common to Virginia Woolf and other modernists. So Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, they are modernist writers, since they talk of a dilemma arising in the era of uncertainty and stasis in the 20th century. Now, two words are important here: dilemma. You just don't know where to go, and you don't know the reason why. So you remain in a dilemma, and suppose you remain in a dilemma. Suppose I remain in a dilemma for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, then I would feel what I call here in this sentence stasis, lack of movement. I would be frozen, I would be fixed. I just wouldn't know where to go because I am in a state of dilemma. So these writers talk of dilemma. They are not moving from one place to another. They are not producing for us, for our use, a kind of argument that will take us forward. In fact, for them there is nothing like forward. If somebody says I am forward looking, then they would say, where do you go? There is nowhere to go, because there can be a Second World War also. And in fact, they are right, because very soon after the First World War, clouds of the Second World War start hovering over the world. First World War ends in 1917-18, and in 1939, with a gap of 22 years, another World War begins. So that dilemma actually is exacerbated. It is made stronger. It is made worse than before, and people are sad, people are depressed, and they are living from one state of depression to another. That is what the modernism of that kind is. So dilemma arising in the era of uncertainty. Everybody is uncertain. Nobody knows the answers. And stasis is the word that I have already explained to you. So Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, these people are not carriers of positive thought. They are carriers of the actual state of mind of people in Europe around the time the First World War happened, starting from, let's say, 1910 to 1930. And I told you earlier that most of the writing of Virginia Woolf, for instance, is about the post-First World War scenario. Then we go to the next point, modernism assumes a universalist connotation. What does it mean? So modernism doesn't belong to England alone or to Europe alone. It is universal. So they start saying that. They say, okay, we are not historicists. We don't bother about history, but then we bother about the actual conditions as they use the word. So everywhere in the world, people are feeling sad. People are feeling dilemma-ridden. They just don't know where to go. And this might also be true to a certain extent if you stretch the point that in India there are poor people, they live a kind of existence of a slave, and they don't know where to go, and they don't have any answer anywhere. Therefore, they also are modernists in their thinking, in their experience. You can say that. You can stretch the point. But then modernism assumes a universalist connotation. So what modernism thinks in terms of the experience of Europe actually is prolonged then, is expanded to cover the whole world. All human beings are alone. All human beings have their own self to think of. So nobody is anybody's son, nobody is anybody's daughter, nobody is anybody's friend, nobody is anybody's lover, nothing. They are all individuals, and as individuals they are spread all over the world. So this is a doctrine that comes from modernism, that when you are alone, when I am alone, then only I think about the real me. So they become a prototype of mankind itself. The entire mankind actually is typified by modernist thinking. This is what they start saying. Now it's a good point to be philosophical about, but then it doesn't give us anything positive to pursue. It simply says you can't pursue anything, so just be. You just sit down and you just hang your head and then say, okay, I'm alone and I'm suffering. And if somebody asks you, is there a way that you can come out of suffering? Then they say, no, we are fated to suffer. You read the modernist writing of T.S. Eliot, the whole world is a wasteland and nothing grows there. So this is the kind of thinking that modernism developed. And then coming to Virginia Woolf, the novel that I'll be discussing in this particular lecture, I'll be referring to, is Mrs. Dalloway. Because in that novel, what happens is that the writer has chosen one particular day. When it's morning, the novel begins. Mrs. Dalloway is planning to have a party at her place in the evening, and she has started preparing for that party in the morning. That's when the novel begins. Mrs. Dalloway comes out of her home and she says, I want to buy flowers. So she goes to a shop where flowers are sold, and on the way she is thinking. So the novel pages after pages are about her thinking, what she thinks about. She goes to a street and then she starts thinking about that street. Then she looks up and in the sky there's something happening and she starts thinking about that. Then she meets a person and then she goes into his past. Then with the help of that person, she goes into her past. When the novel begins, she is in her late 40s, about 50 years, and she starts thinking about her young days. She had a friend, and how that friend wanted to marry her. She also loved him, but finally she married Mr. Dalloway. Now that she is 50 years and she is already married, she is just going over her memories. So this is what modernism is. Modernism is not about the consideration of active life. Modernism, so far as Virginia Woolf is concerned, and particularly in this novel, modernism is about memory of the old time. That old time which has ceased to exist for all practical purposes, but it is there, still there inside us. So that is modernism for Virginia Woolf and for the novels that she is writing. Then a very important aspect of Virginia Woolf's novels is stream of consciousness. This is important for her writing. And how is it explained? The faculty of human thinking never remains fixed. It always goes back and forth in time, from the past to the present and from the present to the past. Is that true? Yes, you can say it makes sense, because when we sit alone, then we start thinking about something. There is no logic there. The logic would occur only when we take a stand and when we become active in life, but we simply move around, or we sit at a place, and then we start thinking. A stream of thinking that starts happening in our mind. Yesterday leads us to day for yesterday, and day for yesterday leads us to a place, and that place leads to another place. So that way we keep on thinking for an hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours, and Mrs. Dalloway is doing nothing but this. She has gone to the flower shop in the morning, and when she comes back, already the novel is this description occupies 40-50 pages. And what do those 40 pages tell us? They tell us about her memories of the earlier life. So memory creates a kind of stream inside our mind. It's a stream. It's a kind of a small river where water is flowing, and when the water flows, it doesn't know whether it is moving left side or right side, or whatever side it moves towards. That side is important. And the same is true about the mind. You don't control the mind, because you can't control the water. You can't control the stream. Therefore, let it go on. So stream of consciousness is that kind of a technique where people think and keep thinking. The other important and interesting thing about Virginia Woolf is, and this novel is, that when you think, when the character thinks, then sometimes new combinations happen. For instance, when Mrs. Dalloway thinks about her lover, whose name is Peter Walsh, then she thinks about his life, because she married another man, and he went away from England. He went to India, and on the way he met some woman, and he married her. Later on he left her, and he fell in love with another person, this time a married woman, and he in the meantime has decided to divorce her. Now all this is happening where? Not in reality, because Mrs. Dalloway is thinking about him. He writing to her, and she refers to her letters, and then he comes, and then even if he has not met her, he meets her, and they talk for a few minutes, but then that also is in the memory, because most of the time they always live, most of the time they live in the memory alone. The faculty of human thinking never remains fixed. That is the principle of the stream of consciousness, and there is no movement, there is no direction, and that is what stream of consciousness is, and that is what is there as the prime example of 20th century fiction, particularly in the hands of Virginia Woolf. The word stream signifies this specifically. The focus upon the stream of consciousness will make us aware about the internal processes of an individual's mind. Is the internal process important for us? I would say yes. And this particular aspect has been covered, has been actually externalized by great scientists like Freud in the latter half of the 19th century and in the 20th century itself. And human mind became very important. So these people started saying, okay, now we will not talk about society. We will talk about the human mind. How does human mind live? Now, it's a progressive thing in the sense, that study of the human mind is a secular idea. Please start thinking in positive terms about stream of consciousness and about modernist writing, because what modernist writers tell us is that the human mind also is a reality, and that reality has to be explored in a different way. And if you do that, then you connect with the history and with the society at a different level. Suppose you say that with the help of the mind you can go to some Greek myths and start reworking them in your mind. Is that possible? I am asking a question. You have started thinking about a Greek character who lived, or who might have been created by the writer, let's say 3,000 years ago, and you start thinking like him. Definitely there will be insights, And one good thing about this kind of an endeavor is that you will be getting away from philosophy into an actual experience that you will have in your mind. So you will have a different view of Greece, you will have a different view of Rome, you will have a different view of the world around, and that certain aspects will emerge before you which otherwise wouldn't have emerged. And that is because in the 19th century people like Freud, they started getting away from the idea of divinity, and they started talking about the mysteries of the human mind. So who knows, if the 20th century makes us aware about the mysteries of the human mind, then some kind of valuable information will occur to us, and we'll be saying that this is an important thing. So I'm now talking about the positive aspects of modernism, and one is that individual human mind, that becomes the kind of place where you can belong, and then you can look at the whole world in a different manner. Let's go over the next point. It should be clear to us that being socially repressed, women generally are confined to the world of dreams, fears, and expectations. This connects us with modernism, because modernism gives us an idea about the inner processes of a woman, and Virginia Woolf, being a woman, is able to tell us about her fears. Now, fears are apprehensions, they are threats, they might be real, and actually if they are not real in themselves, they are able to tell us about the states of mind of women. So what makes Virginia Woolf a feminist? One answer can be that modernism makes her a feminist, because in modernism she starts delving deep into her mind. Her novels tell us about the apprehensions and dreams and fantasies of women of the 20th century, and that this way she is able to get a new idea of freedom in the novels that she wrote. So feminism also has some kind of a connection. Women were never a part of the social world. They always remained confined to the home and to the private world, and to the idea of emotions. And in the 20th century, when modernism occurs and when people start taking interest in the mind, then the women come forward and they start saying, okay, this is what we have been thinking all the time inside our minds. So I would say that one of the offshoots of, positive offshoots of modernism, and particularly in the context of Virginia Woolf, is that women have come forward with their own dreams and fancies and fantasies to tell us that these fears are real fears, and that a kind of division between the males and the females can be visualized on the strength of insights that modernism offers. So Virginia Woolf has that particular role to play in the 20th century fiction, that she tells us about the reality from the point of women, about the cruel aspects that are revealed by, let's say, the family. The family, the larger society, seldom allow women to take important decisions in life. Indeed, the outside world is entirely under the control of men. As such, Virginia Woolf can be comprehended as a writer through the imaginings in her novels. So imagining also is important, and that is to be kept in mind. Especially, and I now conclude with this. There is a quotation from Mrs. Dalloway, a specimen of the modernist fiction in the words of Peter Walsh. Peter Walsh was the lover of Mrs. Dalloway. And what does he say? A failure, which I am in their sense. He's talking about his failure. He thought, in the Dalloway sense. Oh yes, he had no doubt about that. He was the failure compared with all this, the inlaid table, the mounted paper knife. I conclude with this, that the modern man in the 20th century accepts that he is a failure, and who is to blame for this, that we can discuss. But then definitely in the wake of the First World War, and when the clouds are there of the Second World War also over the sky, then human beings can't think of victory, they can think only of failure. So the failure tells us about the reality of senseless destruction that has been unleashed by the wars in the 20th century. So I would call that modernism that way is a realistic product of the 20th century scenario of destruction and devastation. And it is this that should be recognized in the context of Virginia Woolf, who in her novels in general and Mr. Dalloway in particular was able to tell us that finally human beings just do not know where to go and what to do, but they at the same time want to go out of it, and their failure in fact suggests the basic reality of the stasis of the 20th century. So this is how we interpret Virginia Woolf in the positive sense. Feminism comes out of it. The actual state of the human beings comes out of it, and then it also lays the ground for further thinking regarding how to actually move out of this kind of a scenario. Thank you.